The Man of Steel arrives in this Atari archive. We've come to the first of 3 VCS games published in the fall of 1979, and it's a doozy. Superman is an incredibly ambitious game, completely unlike anything seen up to this point on the VCS or its competitors. Indeed, it's an experience more in line with the games one would find specially made for computers. And what's more, Superman absolutely succeeds in these ambitions. It's a multi-screen adventure with a story, distinct goals the player has to achieve before they can reach an actual win state, and a conclusion to the tale and the game. Superman is, as you'd expect, based off of the influential DC Comics character created back in 1938 by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Superman is not the first licensed video game ever made, that honor goes to the Fonz, a 1976 arcade game by Sega. But it is probably the first unique one, given that Fonz was just a rebranded version of Sega's road race game. It's also an early example of corporate synergy in the game industry. Warner owned both Atari and DC Comics at the time, and had just published the hugely successful Richard Donner Superman movie in December 1978. It wasn't hard to find Superman merchandise aimed at kids from then through 1979, and according to developer John Dunn in a 2000 interview with Game Chambers, Warner had specifically put Atari up to the task of producing an accompanying game as soon as possible. Atari's managers initially requested Warren Robinette do it, as he was working on what would become Adventure at the time, and they figured with his game being fairly early into development, it could be converted into a Superman game. Robinette was on vacation when they had seen his prototype and learned of this during a programmers meeting, and it was a real good news, bad news deal. He had the green light to continue work on his game, but he had to repeatedly insist that while he'd move away from his fantasy-themed game if he had to, he really didn't want to. Dunn volunteered to take on the job, on the condition that he could use a 4KB ROM chip on the cart. With the exceptions of Casino and Hangman, every game we've seen so far for the VCS has been written within 2KB. They were smaller games, but they were also cheaper to produce, and Atari was loath to spend the extra money on 4K cart sizes to the point where the majority of game developers were not allowed to expand beyond 2K without specific permission. There were exceptions, which we'll talk about in the next 2 videos, but suffice it to say, following Superman, 4K games would become more normalized. With pressure from Warner, manager George Simcock approved Dunn's request, but given his art background and the concern he would go artsy and drag out development, Dunn was given a strict timeline to turn a game around. Robinette provided Dunn with the kernel, functionally a game engine, that he'd already made for Adventure to get him started, and Dunn set to work on making the heavy modifications necessary to make his game. What Dunn ended up with is similar to the arguably better-known Adventure in enough ways that it's clear that they have the same starting point, but it's also a distinct title in its own right. In Superman, the player starts off as Superman's alter ego Clark Kent on his way to work at the Daily Planet newspaper, when the villain Lex Luthor and his henchmen blow up the Metropolis Memorial Bridge and scatter. Ducking into a phone booth, the player then becomes Superman himself, with the task of tracking down the bridge pieces to rebuild it, capturing Luthor and his henchmen and placing them in the Metropolis jail, and then changing back into Clark Kent in the phone booth and going to work at the Daily Planet. It's a simple narrative, but at a time when any narrative was a rarity in video games, let alone a console game, this was quite a feat. Playing as Superman allowed Dunn to utilize the character's unique traits and abilities. With the ability to fly, players aren't restricted to moving left and right in the game world. They can fly either up or down to skip ahead to another part of the game map. Pressing the controller button allows players to look ahead to the surrounding screens using his X-ray vision, a clever way to help players get the hang of moving around in this new multi-screen adventure and find their targets. Before Superman, there aren't any console video games with multiple screens for players to navigate, and computers were expensive enough that few people actually owned them to play anything remotely similar. This was a new world for most players, and giving them a tool to see their surroundings was a wise design choice on Dunn's part. The cacophony of sound that Dunn chose for the X-ray vision deserves special notice too. The soundscapes of early VCS games typically, though not always, tried to match up with real-world sounds of vehicles or activities. But here is an early example of a game designer picking sound effects that really have no real-world counterpart, but it still sounds like X-ray vision. quite a feat with the VCS's limited audio capabilities. True to Superman's weakness, Luthor and his crew have launched kryptonite satellites to depower the hero, leaving him unable to fly or able to pick up people or bridge pieces. These float throughout the world map, including when Superman is using his X-ray vision. To counter its effects, players throw DC Comics lore out the window and track down Lois Lane, Superman's longtime love interest. Once you've touched her, Superman is back in action. The right difficulty switch adjusts the speed of Luthor's crew and the kryptonite satellites to make them faster or slower, while the left one adjusts whether or not Lois Lane comes to you when you're depowered, or you have to track her down. Players can also pause the game by pressing the game select switch, a rare option on the VCS. The game world features subway stations that Superman can enter to travel quickly around the city, including from the Daily Planet itself. Finally, there's a helicopter. The helicopter flies around the game world, and will pick up bridge pieces and kryptonite satellites as it moves around, though functionally it doesn't tend to make as big an impact on the game as you'd think. In another nod to the comics, the player has brought Lois Lane to the Daily Planet and the helicopter goes by outside. She'll leave to go after it and try and get a scoop. In all, there's a lot going on here, and it works. True to the source material, Superman can't actually die, only slow down. As such, the goal of the game is to simply complete it as quickly as possible. To that end, Dunn included a timer, functionally producing an early speedrunning game in the process. Dunn managed to infuse a lot of personality into the game, and his efforts paid off. Superman is an absolute classic on the platform, and Dunn brought a new level of refinement, artistry, and sheer inventiveness to the VCS. I would go so far as to say that it's probably still the best Superman game out there. The on-screen indicators of the villains in the top left let you know how many are left to capture and take to the jail. And while there's no such indicator for the bridge pieces, the fact that there's only 3 of them make it pretty simple to figure out. Once you've dropped all 3 pieces on the bridge screen, they'll automatically assemble. Navigating the map takes a little getting used to, as it doesn't line up into a proper square, but the X-ray vision helps. More awkward is Superman's tendency to fall when you're flying if you stop moving, which in a sense is in keeping with his original skill set of just being able to jump really high. And if you let him touch down while he's carrying someone or something, he'll let go, meaning Luthor and his crew can try to get away. You can fortunately hold him in the air by holding down the button on the controller, which puts him into X-ray vision mode. The game does suffer from flicker when multiple objects are on screen, which does come up during gameplay, but honestly, these are minor gripes. The game plays well once you get the hang of it, and probably owing to Dunn's artistic background, Superman looks great. This is easily the prettiest VCS game to date, with a 21-screen cityscape that is, for using low-resolution background graphics, rather distinctive. The higher resolution elements, such as the phone booth, bridge, subway entrances, jail, and Daily Planet logo, are all recognizable. The human characters are where the game really shines, however. The rare occasions we've seen VCS developers draw human characters, they've all been one color, as that's much easier for the system to render. But here, every character is brightly colored with their own clothing and accoutrements, from Luthor's helicopter backpack to the hats Clark Kent and the rest of the cast wear, to the little Tommy guns Luthor's henchmen carry around. Superman may not have hair, but considering he has his distinctive blue and red costume, he's already head and shoulders more sophisticated than anyone else to come before him on the platform. And there are cute moments of animation, such as Lois Lane's leg kick when she touches Superman, which is designed to suggest a kiss. Dunn didn't include a black and white mode, but admittedly the game relies on color for navigation, particularly within the 5-screen subway system, so it's possible he just didn't have the time to make it work in grayscale. Once you've gotten the hang of the game, you can complete it quickly on the basic difficulty level, especially if you've got the world map handy. Until you've gotten a sense for how each screen connects to the others, navigating the city can get tricky owing to its odd shape. The options provided by the difficulty switches expand the game's length by making you work harder to catch your foes and stay powered up, but ultimately you're still rushing through in a matter of minutes. Interestingly, there are tricks that allow you to keep the bridge intact and leave you to just catch the villains, or even to skip straight to the Daily Planet and finish the game within seconds. Dunn said of the latter one that he hadn't planned that trick in the game but found it during development, and thinking it was cool, he just left it in. Even today's speedruns for the game have to specify whether or not any of these tricks will be used. If there is any weakness to Dunn's game, it's the two-player cooperative mode. In this game type, one player controls Superman's vertical movement and the other his horizontal. Dunn said simply that it sucked, and that he wished he'd had the time to make a proper cooperative mode, likely with the second player controlling Lois and giving her more to do. While this does mean he produced an early, if awkward, example of a co-op game, I can't help but wonder how an asymmetrical cooperative game like he had thought about would have turned out, what kind of influence that could have had. Contemporary reporting sings the praises of the game. Superman leads off an Arcade Alley column in the April 1980 Video magazine, where authors Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz declared that there were no video games remotely similar to it. They further refer to it as assured for a Video Arcade Hall of Fame spot when also asking for more games in the same vein. Indeed, they gave it Game of the Year in the first issue of Electronic Games, referring to it as the most important release of 1980, illustrating that with few exceptions, games didn't really drop on specific dates in this era, but rather just trickled out to stores over time. The September 1980 Space Gamer issue reviewed both Superman and Adventure, and the reviewer, Norman Howe, heaped much of his praise on the former, considering it more interesting and complex than Adventure, and the best Atari game on the market. While it's hard to get a fix on the game's sales, it was heavily promoted in print ads early on, even including a campaign for a free Superman wallet, and got a new lease on life when Superman 2 hit American theaters in 1981. It continued to be advertised in Atari catalogs through 1983, though it finally vanished from the 1984 catalog. The game doesn't appear to have been sold in the Atari Corporation years, but this isn't surprising. The company had spun off of Warner and likely no longer had the Superman rights as a result. It did appear to still be appreciated into 1982 when Video Game Illustrated printed a strategy guide to the game. Superman does seem to be the first of a few VCS games to get delayed. Initially, the game was advertised in trade magazines to come out in the summer, but the earliest newspaper advertisements I've found for it don't come out until September. With delays also hitting Video Chess and Basic Programming, the latter pushed all the way back into 1980, it's possible that Atari either had issues producing enough 4K-sized cartridges, or were still getting a handle on new game releases coming year-round instead of just every fall. We'll talk more about these potential delays with the Video Chess episode coming up, but either way, Superman doesn't seem to have been impacted too badly, probably because it was such a high-profile game. This would be Dunn's sole VCS release. Prior to Superman, he said he worked on a game called Snark, a maze game where players would have to shoot monsters as they navigate their way through a randomly generated labyrinth. Snark went unpublished due to intense color cycling, and concerns within the company that it could cause seizures. And after Superman, Dunn tried to push management to produce more games with, as he called them, positive subliminal messages. For example, a Dungeons & Dragons game where challenging the dragon to a puzzle would get a better result than just fighting it. This was a forward-thinking piece of game design that Superman alludes to, but one that management didn't go for on a more focused level. Dunn left the company with the intention of making such games independently, but ended up finding that the graphics editor was more interesting than the game he was working on anyway, ultimately publishing it as the paint program Slide Master. Dunn passed away in 2018 after a career working on algorithmic music and art programs. I must thank the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine for saving his in-depth Game Chambers interview with Randy Ball long after the website went offline. While not every game coming down the VCS pipeline will be quite as impressive as Superman, it's hard to imagine that titles like Pitfall or Fathom would have come together quite as they did in a world without it, or Adventure due to Robinette's base-level coding. And as for Adventure, Robinette's game would be published in 1980 and is rightly considered a hugely influential title that is inarguably better remembered today. But Superman was a big deal at its own release, and set the market expectation for more advanced games that allowed developers to work on bigger and bigger game sizes on more ambitious projects. It also frankly does some things better than Adventure, notably having recognizably human characters. So while its sibling may get more accolades today, Superman remains one of the gems of the VCS library. It's without question the standout game on the platform from its first 3 years on the market, and a bright sign of things to come. Next time, we look into the first of two strategy board games that closed out 1979.